This is Manhattan Insights, a Manhattan Institute production. I'm your host, Raihan Salam. Between 2020 and 2022, California, by far the nation's most populous state, saw its population decline by more than 500,000. Among those leaving the Golden State, the billionaire entrepreneur Elon Musk, whom relocated to booming Texas, a state that famously has no individual income tax. Are these high-profile cases outliers, or do they represent an emerging trend in our newly remote world? How can policymakers position their states to succeed in an era of intensified interstate tax competition? Joshua Rauh is a professor of finance at the Stanford Graduate School of Business and a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. A specialist in corporate and public sector finance, he joins us on this episode to discuss the influence of tax policy on migration across state lines.
We should be letting federalism work. If California can deliver a model that's a high tax, high service model, and they can do it efficiently, people will want to move there. If they can't, people will want to leave. And people will sort into the places where they want to go, where they get the package of taxes and of social services, public services, best suits their needs. And I think the federal government should just be thinking about what are the policies we can put in place to let that mechanism work as best as it can.
Josh, there's a theory about state income taxes that goes something like this. Say you're a state like California, an incredibly attractive, amenity-rich, opportunity-rich state. And if you're someone who is a successful person, you've likely built a business there over a really long time. You have friendships there, you have relationships, you have business associates in the area. That means that pretty much whatever the state income tax rate is, you're likely to stick around. Now, in your recent work, you've been suggesting that that's not quite right, that high-income taxpayers are not necessarily so sticky that they're indifferent to state income taxes. Tell us more about that.
Well, that's exactly right. They're not nearly as sticky as people usually think. When taxpayers in California experienced an increase in the top marginal tax rate from 10.3% to 13.3% in 2013, by a referendum decision of the people called Proposition 30, there was a very large spike in the rate of out-migration of high earners in California. And the more they earned, the more their out-migration rate increased. This is what you would expect. Taxpayers are sensitive to tax rates. They have options. They have different places that they can go. And there are a lot of other states out there that are providing much more tax-friendly environments. So we found when we looked at individual income tax data of the universe of taxpayers in California that there was a pretty dramatic increase in people leaving, and that this ends up costing the state a fair amount of money.
So what is it that happened with that tax increase in particular? Because, it takes quite a while for you to get up to 10.3% as your top tax rate. So is it the case that earlier tax increases just didn't have the same kind of strong response?
Well, that level of tax rate had been in place for quite some time, as a matter of fact. In 2004, there had been an increase in imposition of a millionaire's tax on incomes of over $1 million from 9.3% to 10.3%. Interestingly, that tax was built the Mental Health Services Act, because the funding from that was supposed to be earmarked or directed to funding mental health services provided by the state. Of course, the state of California is in a major crisis as far as mental health is concerned. Everything from the results of the COVID lockdowns to all the people out in the streets living homeless, who are many of whom are suffering from serious mental illness. So, yeah, the 9.3% rate was in for quite some time, went up to 10.3% in 2004, and then the additional rates going up to 13.3% in 2012, effective 2013. And of course, the big change, also another big change that affected California taxpayers, was that in 2018, state and local taxes were made no longer deductible under the federal tax code. At least they were capped at a $10,000 deduction under the federal tax code. And that increased the wedge between what a person would pay by being a resident of California versus resident of another state. And even though that was part of a federal bill called the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, which cut taxes for a lot of Americans and also a lot of high income Americans. For high income earners in a state like California, where such a large portion of income is going to the state, it actually resulted in a net tax increase for the majority of very high earning Californians.
I wonder, California in particular has seen a huge amount of economic growth associated with the agglomeration in Silicon Valley. To a lesser extent, you have other hubs in Southern California around the entertainment industry. And I guess the thesis is that when you're looking at those agglomerations, those are places that are essentially minting millionaires and billionaires. They afford connections that you can't really make in other places. So I wonder, is it the case that agglomeration effect is growing weaker? Or are the people who are exiting California in response to that tax increase, are they people who say are at the tail ends of their careers, not necessarily in their prime earning years? How do those factors intersect?
Well, it's a fragile equilibrium. As you point out, people do still come to California to start companies, but fewer people come to California to start companies compared to previously. And it starts looking very attractive to stay in a low-income tax state if you're thinking about building a business. California also puts, of course, a lot of other obstacles in place to growing a business, regulatory obstacles, very, very high housing costs that can make it difficult to hire and to retain high quality staff. So I think you're hitting on the right question, which is that if California can keep attracting the new business builders, the next founders of Google and Facebook, then the state can keep chugging along economically to some extent. The challenge is if those people no longer are interested in starting business in California, that if instead they decide to locate their businesses in other states.
You are an expert on public finance. You've been working on the subject for some years now. You're, I would argue, one of the nation's leading experts. And I wonder, when you're looking at reliance on these steeply progressive income taxes, does that have some effect, for example, when you hit a recession, when you hit some other economic downturn, on the state's fiscal health?
The top 1% of taxpayers in California pay 50% of the taxes. And another feature of the California tax code is that capital gains are taxed as ordinary income. So ordinary income, business income, wages and salaries, those are taxed at that 13.3% for someone who's in the top bracket, as are all capital gains. And as a result, there is a very, very high sensitivity of taxable income and tax revenues to the performance of the stock market. So if we just take a basic model of California's tax revenues and we do some econometrics and measure the relationship between tax revenues and things like economic growth and the stock market and so on, it doesn't take much of a recession to get a really dramatic contraction in tax revenues. When we model out a decline in the stock market by, say, 20%, and a recession involving a decline in GDP by one percentage point, we find that the state would suddenly be faced with a $50 billion hole that it would need to fill.
Fascinating. And when you're looking at an economic downturn, that's oftentimes when people are in most need of services and what have you. That's when oftentimes the demand on state and local government tends to increase.
Yes, and this has been, in some ways, I guess, as an economist, a puzzle for me for a long time. Why is it that states build revenue models that are so pro-cyclical when really the idea of government is that it's going to be there in times where the private economy might need some support? By having such fragility naturally built in to the structure of raising revenues for the state, it really kind of defeats the purpose, one of the main purposes of government in many ways. Another area where I've pointed to a similar phenomenon is in the area of pension funding and how state and local governments tend to fund their pensions with pretty risky portfolios of assets. I mean, their portfolios of assets basically look not unlike that of a major university endowment or of a wealthy family office. They're not thinking about the idea that, hey, if the stock market declines and then we have to start putting more money into this pension fund, that's going to be money that's going to be taken away from public services exactly at the time when people might need that money the most. And so it's really doing the opposite of what we think a risk management program would do. A risk management program sets you up so that when if you have a bad outcome, it's not during a time when you really, really need the money. And a lot of state budgets are kind of built on the opposite, anti-risk management. And California, based on the highly progressive tax structure, the treatment of capital gains, and the just general volatility of taxable income, is really the king of them all in that regard.
Josh, I'm curious if you've given any thought to the interaction between federal and state taxes. You mentioned this state and local tax deduction earlier on and the fact that it was recently capped. But it does seem as though when you're thinking about things from the perspective of the United States and how we're faring economically as a country, that when you're looking at people residing in California, New York, other high tax states, it's not just the 37% top marginal tax rate. You're also looking at these very significant state taxes on top of them. Is there a way in which the states are cannibalizing the federal government? Are they making some of these taxes less efficient than they might otherwise be? I'm just kind of curious about that interaction.
Well, one thing that we found in our study that I think is very important to emphasize is that the state actually may want to be more worried about the losses in taxable income from the people who stay than they are about outmigration, or than they should be about outmigration. And the reason is that for the people who stay in the state, we observe pretty big differences in the evolution of their taxable income going forward when we focus on high earners. Our study has a really interesting design where what we do is, because anybody who even earns a small amount of income in California has to file a tax return with the state of California, we actually are able to study the tax returns not only of high-income Californians, but also high-income people from a lot of other states. And when we compare how the incomes of the California residents versus the non-residents who might have just had a de minimis, a small amount of income in California, how those two income levels evolve after Prop 30, after this very, very large tax increase, we find a really significant divergence between the two. And in economist terms, we like to talk about something called the elasticity of taxable income, which is kind of a term for how sensitive is people's earning behavior to the tax rate. Another way to look at it is just how much of the gains that the state would have had if people hadn't responded are eroded away by people's behavioral responses. And there we find that about 55 cents on the dollar of gains the state would otherwise have had are eroded away by people's responses. And most of that is actually from the responses of people who stay. Their business income isn't growing as much as it otherwise would. They're shifting their business activities offshore, or they're finding other ways to reduce their taxable income. And the reason I mention this in the context of your question is that we find that this also impacts federal taxable income, the reported federal taxable income. There comes a point where if you run a business in California and over a period of time, you see your tax rate go up from 9.3% to 13.3%, that's a big tax increase. And it's one that it might lead you to leave the state, but it might also just lead you to start doing really, really aggressive tax planning. And to start doing things that will reduce the amount of taxable income they report to the state, including just not investing in that next business that you otherwise would have because the marginal tax rate is just too high. And this is kind of the foundation of the famous Laffer curve proposed by Art Laffer, on a napkin in the 1980s. Yeah, he was thinking not so much about people leaving the United States, but just about less income being generated, fewer businesses being formed, people working less. And the evidence that we find in California is very consistent with that. And so when the state raises top income tax rates by 4 percentage points over a period of 8 years, that leads to losses in economic activity that then also hit the federal government. And one other thing I just want to add about that is that the top rate is going up to 14.4% next year, because there was a bill that passed at the end of last year that Governor Newsom signed that uncaps a payroll tax rate that pays for a state disability/family leave program. And so that the removal of that cap now means that an additional 1.1 percentage points of tax rate is going to be felt by the top earners. It's now up to 14.4%. So I think the state is really playing with fire with both the intensive and extensive margins. So the intensive margin is what people are doing who are staying, and the extensive margin is the people who leave entirely.
I'm curious just to kind of think this through a bit in the form of an example. So, you can imagine a scenario where there is a 50-year-old. She is part of a company that's about to have an IPO. She's about to have a big realization event, and she's looking to the future. It's not necessarily going to happen right now. She could have some control over exactly when it happens, but she might decide to move to a state that is not going to tax her capital income now, so as to avoid having that realization event while she's in California. Then you could have another person who's living in California who's deciding, this climate is getting pretty hairy, but you know what, I'm going to downshift a bit. I'm not going to kind of work flat out anymore. I'm in a different phase of my career. I want to relax. I want to take my foot off the gas, and I'll stay in California, but I'm not necessarily going to do the things that I would have done otherwise. Are those kind of two examples that kind of fit the story you're telling?
Absolutely, those are definitely examples that fit the story, and we do see companies. More and more companies are leaving the state as well, and a lot of times the founders of those companies still have got unrealized capital gains from stock options or restricted stock units that they own in these companies, and so for them, the return of having to return so much income to the state when they realize these positions is extremely costly. And so for them, when their companies move to other states, that's a major benefit for them.
I'm curious, if you're a state lawmaker in California and you're very committed to this agenda of making the tax code more progressive, increasing taxes on the highest earners, what is the next step? So, perhaps one step would be looking at individuals who've been in California, who are leaving, trying to somehow claw back that revenue, trying to find, a nexus and defining that ever more loosely. Are there lawmakers now who are trying to do more to ensure that people can cleanly leave the state, that they will continue to have these heavy tax obligations, even if they decide to pick up stakes and move?
Well, there is a movement afoot to put a wealth tax in place, and the wealth tax would be something where you couldn't escape just by leaving the state immediately. There'd basically be an exit tax. And, like all wealth taxes, this is going to be very, very damaging to the state. And the reason is that having that dragnet there, that might capture a few people who might otherwise not be able to get out. And it might work for sort of the first generation of people, but it's not a sustainable solution, because what's going to happen is there's just going to be ever increased tax planning, and people are just not going to build wealth in California anymore. This is why I think something like 36 countries in the OECD have tried wealth taxes at one point or another. And I think only 4 of them still have wealth taxes. And part of that has to do with the fact that it just turns out to be very, very difficult to try to trap the wealth inside. And it's not because they didn't think of the idea of having exit taxes.
I'm curious. I imagine a proposal like that would face some kind of legal challenge. Have you looked into that possibility at all? The idea that something like a state-level wealth tax might meet with a legal challenge?
Well, I don't know. I'm sure it would get a legal challenge. I am not enough of a legal analyst to know the likelihood that something like that would be sustained or not. I imagine the architects of it would be trying to construct it in a way that would be robust to legal challenges. I would just be very worried about the impact that this is going to have. And I think that lawmakers are good at trying to figure out ways to do these types of extremely progressive tax structures in ways that are going to get past legal challenge. And at the end of the day, it ends up being up to courts. But I think they're going to try to do it in a way that overcomes those challenges. And really, the only way back for California is one that tries to move the tax code in a direction more of a flatter tax rate structure. This Prop 30 that put in the 13.3% tax rate in 2012, voted in 2012, went into effect in 2013. It was renewed in 2015 ballot referendum through 2030. And that seemed like a very, very long time away. It still is a very long time away. The state could be, could well be bankrupt within the next 7 years. But at very least, there is a sunset provision on these very, very high top tax rates. The reason I'm looking to the sunset provision rather than looking to a reversal of Prop 30 of these top rates is that I just think a reversal is just impossible in a situation where you have individuals voting on these things. I mean, again, these go to a referendum, and in referenda, the idea of, we're going to tax these top earners, these tend to be very, very popular. I mean, that extension proposition passed by a very, very wide margin, 63% in favor. It's always popular. It seems like it's always popular when you ask people if they want to tax somebody who's richer than they are. And the fact is that even though the top 1% pay 50% of the taxes, they're only 1% of the voters. So, and we can point to the legislature and say, well, why doesn't the legislature do something? I mean, they could not make it worse. They're responsible for the going up to the 14.4% from the 13.3%. But a lot of these tax increases were passed by popular vote. And it's very, very hard to make the case to the public that we need to lower taxes on millionaires. But the fact is that those millionaires are generating a lot of jobs and a lot of activity for the state. And I think this is really one of the key challenges I think that people in the sort of anti-tax or low tax movement face, is just convincing people, making people realize that when you might think that by voting to tax somebody who's in the top 1% more, that you're doing something to improve the lives of all. But really, you're reducing economic dynamism, you're reducing job creation, you're reducing investment in the state, you're pushing money elsewhere. And while it might feel like a good thing to do, it actually isn't.
I'm curious what you make of the argument that's been made by many lawmakers in California and elsewhere in Congress, which is that the real culprit here is the capping of the SALT deduction. The SALT deduction will, when individual provisions of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act expire a couple years hence, will come back in full force unless something else is done. One argument is that this was actually something that was a really negative development. It was punishing blue states that are looking to do right by their citizens. What do you think about the SALT cap as public policy? Do you believe that that was something that was unfair to the state of California and its efforts to raise revenue? Or do you think that it was a reasonable public policy decision?
I mean, the question you have to ask is, why should the citizens of the other states in the country support California's profligate spending ways? I mean, it's the question that would come into my mind first would be, was the previous existing structure fair or not? And it was extremely unfair, because California could raise tax rates by 4 percentage points as they did, and high-income Californians might only feel 2 percentage points of that, because the other half of it they got to offload onto the federal government. So I think it's quite interesting to see legislators from high income coastal states go into Congress and saying we need to get rid of the SALT cap. Why? Because you enjoy offloading the burden of your own taxes onto citizens of other states who don't benefit from the services that you say that you are providing with the tax revenue. I think the SALT cap was a real restoration of at least some justice to people who are not living in states like California. Why should they have to support California's extremely high tax and extremely inefficient government? One point I also like to make and point out is that California, all this tax money translates into spending. California spends just an almost unfathomable amount of money. The budget, the state budget in California is over $300 billion per year. If you add up local sources that flow through state agencies in California spend over $600 billion a year. And it's not like when you come here, you think the services here are so great. For example, Gavin Newsom has pointed out in the most recent budget that all sources together we spend $24,000 per pupil in our K to 12 schools. $24,000, that puts us really right at the top. But when you look at our performance, it's in the bottom 10. And you can't say, oh, we have specific challenges, we have more non-English speaking immigrants and so on, because you look at a state like Texas, and Texas is doing far, far better with a third of the spending per capita. Maybe you can blame a little of it on the fact that housing costs are so high here. So, you have to pay people to, I guess, keep up the, be able to keep up some standard of living because the housing cost is so high. But that doesn't get you all the way there. So the point is that in a system where other states are supporting, paying for, up to half of California's state spending, they're not only they're paying for spending that they don't benefit from, but they're even paying for spending that a lot of Californians don't benefit from because it's done in such an inefficient way.
Would you advocate extending the SALT cap or perhaps getting rid of the SALT deduction altogether?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the first $10,000 makes that big a difference. It could be eliminated altogether. It surely, from a perspective of tax fairness, it should be eliminated. I haven't heard anybody give me a good argument for why it is that someone living in Texas should have to pay for the spending of the government in California. Even if you believed that spending were completely efficient, it still would be unfair. And then when you just add on the fact that it's completely inefficient spending that is in part its efficacy is hindered by the fact that California doesn't really face much in the way of discipline as far as its spending behavior is concerned. It really seems no reason to have a SALT deduction.
I wonder if part of the story behind the rise of the income tax in California is that other less volatile tax bases are not as readily available. For example, if you're looking at property taxes, that is a tax base that is traditionally considered a less volatile one. Yet my understanding is that California does stringently limit increases in property taxes, particularly for residential property. Is that something that you would look to change with an eye towards making California's tax base more stable and reliable?
Well, it's a great question. In economics, one thing we know is that, you want to tax the thing where there is going to be the least ability of the taxpayer to avoid the tax by doing things that are harmful to society. So an income tax is probably the worst idea you can possibly have because we're taxing something that we want. We're taxing people working. We want people to work. We want them to build businesses. We want them to create jobs. So that's, one of the worst taxes that you can have. Property tax has the somewhat more desirable feature that you're not necessarily discouraging as much economic activity with the property tax as you are with the income tax. You're still discouraging some because you're discouraging development and other things. But especially if you believe that when a municipality raises the property tax, that it gets that raise gets capitalized into the value of the property, meaning the value of the property just kind of goes down. That's the type of tax that is going to be less distortionary. Now, whether completely eliminating, it's called Prop 13. That's the California ballot proposition from the late 70s that limited the increase in property taxes. Whether that is gonna solve our problems or not is kind of hard to say. I mean, it's a very specific setting here where we also have these incredible constraints on the supply of new housing, and so it's possible that if one reduced that property tax, you're just gonna hose people on housing costs even more. Because now, in addition to the already outrageous housing prices, they're gonna have to face property taxes that are more closely linked to those. And the other aspect of Prop 13 that it's worth considering is that Prop 13 does do something. It does favor the people who have been here for a long time versus the new entrants. It's the new entrants who are going to come when they buy a house. They have to pay the property tax based on that transaction value of the house. So if somebody new shows up to California and buys a house that the previous owner has been living in and owning for 30 years, the amount of property tax that is taken in jumps up by a very large multiple, because they might be paying only really a fraction of what the property tax would be based on the market value. So I think in general, a system where there is less income taxation and the way you pay for some of that is a little bit with more property taxation in general, I think that's good. I'm not sure in the California setting that it's gonna be a great idea, just given the fact that housing costs are such a huge problem.
You mentioned housing costs, and I do wonder, when you're looking at taxes versus housing costs, I wonder which you see as the kind of dominant factor in driving out migration. You've documented that high-income households have been out-migrating at higher levels, but California has been hemorrhaging working and middle-class families for a very, very long time. Is your sense that that is chiefly driven by the kind of underlying cost of living from land use regulation and what have you? And that, that has been, when you're looking at overall population declines, a bigger part of the story?
So first thing is, when you line up out-migration rates with taxable income brackets, it goes up as you go up the brackets, both the baselines and the spikes in response to these tax events. So we're talking about the kind of out-migration that's really hammering the franchise tax board. That's our California Department of Revenue, basically. We're talking about very, very high earners who really can still afford a pretty nice house here in California. And they might complain about the cost of living, and they can go and look at Texas or Tennessee and see that they could have an even bigger, even nicer place. But the fact is that they're not really squeezed out. And we have, there are other nice amenities here. Our weather is really good and other things. So I think when you look at overall population counts, and California, in a kind of historic first for the state, lost a congressional seat in the last decennial census. There you are looking at issues that affect the entire income distribution. I think the housing cost one is a major one, and we just have a real culture here of NIMBYism. I mean, that's the term for it. Those who support it say they're just defending their property rights, in the sense that they purchased property. They did so not under the idea that the place where they purchased it would be building a big multifamily development across the street, which both would have negative externalities for them. That would reduce the value of their property directly, plus it increases supply. So and we're really in a kind of a bad equilibrium with this, because everybody who's bought in at some point has sort of seen the housing market increase, and they feel that they stretched really far to get in there in the first place. And so I think we're in a tricky equilibrium where people really just are opposed to real, lifting of restrictions on supply. The state is trying. The state is handing each California municipality what's called a housing element. It's basically a number of new units that each municipality is assigned to have to build, and they have to actually do so in a way that passes muster with the state planning board. They also have to include a certain portion of low income units as well. And this is something where there's a lot of litigation going on. Some cities and towns are complying. Others are just basically letting themselves get sued because, I give an example. I mean, the community where Steph Curry lives, for example, the Golden State Warriors, they are, it's a very, very affluent community with large lots. They say there's just nowhere for them to put the thousands of additional units that the state is asking them to put in. They're just saying no to it. Whether other communities that are conforming will create enough housing to sort of alleviate some of this and create more dynamism and get more people to stay, who are going to be needed as employees for all of the great businesses that the state has. That remains to be seen. Of course, what I wish would happen as an economist is I wish that the town where Steph Curry lives could just pay another neighboring town to take that requirement off of them and to build the units there. Because there are some towns around here that probably would look at the calculation and say, yeah, well, you know what, if if we're going to get another few $100 million of city revenue in exchange for our saying, yeah, we're going to build some more residential units on this vacant lot, well, hey, we'll do it.
I wonder, when you're describing what's been happening, with sensitivity to rising taxes, it seems like there have been a couple of moments. One was this moment where you had this step increase in taxes and you saw outmigration increase. Then you had the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, you had the SALT cap, you had another increase. Then in 2020, you had another quite sizable increase. I wonder if you could tell us a bit about what happened then in response to COVID. How is it that COVID and the shutdowns altered the behavior of a lot of these high-income households?
So, as you mentioned, we see these kind of three spikes in the work that we've done, and we talked about the first two already, Prop 30, and then the SALT cap, and the third one was not so much was not driven by a direct tax policy change in that year, but was driven by just a complete overturning of the entire economy through the lockdowns. And California had a very stringent set of policies in place. We had stay-at-home orders. Our schools were closed for a really long time, and there we saw spikes in outmigration that were even bigger than the tax-driven spikes we'd seen in the past. The way we interpret those, we look at where people went, and interestingly, in some cases they went to sort of similar states to where they were going before, Texas and Florida. Those are the zero income tax states where they were, where people kind of seek a tax haven, seek not to pay individual income tax. We also saw an increase in people going to other states like Colorado that have an income tax, but where schools actually were open a lot more. We saw fewer people going to Nevada, which is right next door, should be an easy place to move, because while Nevada has zero income tax, they still had pretty tight COVID restrictions. So I think what we saw in 2020 was a interaction of a lot of factors. Like people who already were fed up or seeing this as the last straw, that not only did they have to pay these high taxes and bear these high housing costs, but they weren't even able to get any services from it. I mean, it's pretty bad when you pay all these taxes that are most of which are said to go to K-12 education, and you can't even send your kid to school. So I think that was the last straw for a lot of people.
It does seem as though the advent of remote work does represent a serious threat to high-tax states, because if, let's say in broad terms, high-tax states are typically states that are amenity-rich states that offer a wealth of professional opportunities, oftentimes for historic reasons. You have some concentration that's been there for a long time, whether it's financial services or technology. That's not really a direct product of public policy in the short term, at least. You're profiting from that legacy, from that inheritance. But then if remote work is even only slightly diminishing those agglomeration effects, it seems like that's something that could really unravel the attractiveness of some of these regions. And then also, if what you're saying is that, those high taxes are not necessarily purchasing very high quality public services, maybe instead they're just purchasing amenities for public sector workers, it seems like that really is cutting against what you might call the kind of blue state model.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. During the pandemic and the shutdowns, the lockdowns, a lot of companies obviously allowed remote work from anywhere, and people moved away. And there are some companies out there that have tried to bring people back to their offices, but it's hard. And it's at the end of the day, they have to decide, would they rather continue to to employ people on a remote basis or lose them entirely. But I think, as you point out, they're going to be doing the calculation: is it still worth it for us to be here at all? Why are we here? Right? The point of being here is, as you say, these agglomeration economies, and supposedly access to a very, very highly skilled workforce when it comes to technology. But if that's no longer here, if those people want to work remotely anyway, then companies will ask themselves, why are we here? And that's what's happened with obviously a number of companies that have left California. And there's a threat that it would happen in more cases, and it also undermines the creation of new disruptive businesses in California if somebody can be located in Nashville or in Dallas or in Miami. They can create these businesses. They can draw on the workforce that is in those places, which is also very good. They can draw on remote employees, build businesses in places that are just much less stringent on taxes and regulation, on a number of other things that are harmful to business growth.
I'm curious to hear what you see as some of the near-term fallout. San Francisco has experienced pretty significant outmigration, but also the value of commercial property in San Francisco, which has long been a bulwark of the city's tax base, has declined as vacancy rates have climbed. So are you concerned about what might happen as local governments experience this erosion in their tax base? Is that going to force the state into an even more dire fiscal position?
It's interesting because in theory, local governments should actually have the incentive to really try to do something to face their problems. I do think that, and the reason I say that is because the agglomeration aspect is something that cities can really contribute to in either a positive way or a negative way. San Francisco just used to be the place that everybody wanted to be. Now, well, it depends on who you talk to, but certainly when I go there, it's many parts of the city are a much less pleasant place to walk around. So they're actually hurting their own cause by not investing the very substantial funds that they still have and still are receiving, both from the state and from taxes that they impose on residents and fees and other sources of revenue. They're not directing those to things that might address a lot of the problems that the city's facing right now, namely crime and homelessness. And these are problems that resources can address. They can be addressed with crime can be addressed with better policing. Homelessness can be addressed with more actually targeted mental health services, substance abuse treatment services. So I guess I think that while on the one hand, the state's problems may hurt cities and contribute to the pain that cities are feeling, cities have a lot within their own power that they could actually do if the political will were there. What I wonder about a place like San Francisco is my hope for San Francisco will be that something will happen there sort of akin to what happened in New York City in the 1990s, that the voters, at least the ones who are still there, will basically say, we've actually had enough of this, and some of these really lenient policies on crime and on homelessness, they might sound good in progressive theory, but in practice, they are just super destructive to what we want to have here as a city. And maybe they would elect new leadership that would really could potentially make some meaningful changes.
I want to float a theory by you and see what you think about it. So, one view is that California is a state where budget constraints have been very soft. They've been soft because there is this revenue source. You can always raise taxes on high-income households, and then that will take care of any fiscal problems you have. An IPO boom will come along, and that will deliver huge surpluses. You don't really need to worry about the quality of services. Many of your taxpayers, who are the most important part of your tax base, they're not necessarily relying on public services. Maybe they're going to private school. They're living in communities where they're insulated from a lot of the quality of life problems you're describing in California's major cities. And even if you do have a downturn, you have your allies in the federal government who will offer you massive, massive state and local bailouts. And so without those budget constraints, there hasn't really been a way in which you're punished for spending inefficiently and thoughtlessly, rewarding your political allies, et cetera. Does that sound roughly right to you about what's happened in public policy in California over the last 20 or so years?
Some of it does. I think if you look at the public school system in California, there still are a lot of very well-to-do families that send their kids to the public schools, and I've actually really wondered why there hasn't been more of a rebellion over the public schools, because it could come from any part of the income distribution, really. The quality of the public schools is generally, for what we're paying, is generally quite poor. And there just has not been an ability to take on the teachers union politically. And as for your point about the state generally not facing any discipline, I think the big factor is, in fact, the federal government and the continued bailouts. Just the fact that the state knows that the federal government is gonna be there and believes it's always going to be there. And COVID showed that again. Here's tens of billions of dollars. Ultimately, the state didn't actually lose much of anything in the way of own sourced revenue, and yet they still got massive amounts of money from the federal government. So I think the lack of discipline I attribute a lot to that source, and I guess also to some extent to just a misguided belief here about what the word progressive means, and what progressive politics means, and what it is that we should put up with here in the name of progressivism. I think there's really there's a sort of cultural effect going on here too, where California and the West Coast has always been very tolerant of a lot of things, and as opposed to other places where when things start going in a bad direction, folks say, "Yeah, well, wait a minute here. Is this really right for us?"
I wonder, it seems that the rise of remote work and the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the SALT cap deduction, these are things that are imposing some discipline, some constraint. Are there things that Congress can and should do to basically further this along, to impose some spending discipline, some fiscal discipline on states, albeit indirectly? What are some policies that you would recommend?
Well, the SALT cap is number one. The second, which there hasn't been much political will to take on for some time, maybe since Paul Ryan's speakership, but that really needs to be revisited, is converting Medicaid into more of a block grant type of program. Medicaid, I mean, it's, states spend the money, or states manage the program, and they share the funding with the federal government, and the federal government pays a big piece of it. And whenever there's a crisis, the first thing the federal government does is they increase the federal Medicaid assistance percentage, which is the percentage of Medicaid spending that the federal government is kicking into a program where states are deciding, what to spend the money on. I mean, that's, when it's just like, it's similar to the SALT cap. When you know that you're only actually going to have to cough up half the money or a third of the money, you spend more of it. It's kind of not rocket science. And I think because Medicaid is such a big cost for almost all states, but particularly for a state like California, that's the next place that the federal government should be looking. And we should be letting federalism work. If California can deliver a model that's a high tax, high service model, and they can do it efficiently, people will want to move there. If they can't, people will want to leave. And some people will just prefer to live in low tax, low services places. This is all called Thibault sorting, after the famous French economist Thibault. This is basic stuff, and people will sort into the places where they want to go, where they get the package of taxes and of social services, public services that best suits their needs. And I think the federal government should just be thinking about what are the policies we can put in place to let that mechanism work as best as it can.
I've often thought that because of these bailouts you have whenever there is an economic downturn of state and local governments, I've sometimes wondered if it actually would be better to, for example, federalize some programs. If you look at unemployment insurance, Medicaid, perhaps you federalize the component of it that's serving the most low-income, most frankly sympathetic beneficiaries. Because if you have states that are going to be profligate, that are never going to have rainy day funds, they're never going to think ahead, then perhaps you just take that off the table so that you take the most sympathetic cases off the table. I wonder what you think about that idea.
Well, it's certainly preferential to just allowing states to decide how to spend the money and having the federal government, to be the provider of the money. I mean, that's the worst of all possible worlds. Federalizing the Medicaid program, I mean, I think it depends really as to whether it would what type of changes the program would come with, right? You're sketching out a world, a point that we could get to where it's a federal program, but
it's more limited.
It's more limited, exactly. So I think that's the question. Could is that achievable? Can we get to that federalization point while also limiting the scope?
You've also been a leading voice on the profligacy of state and local governments when it comes to their public pensions. And you've argued that the federal government needs to take more responsibility by, at a minimum, demanding that state and local governments adhere to reasonable accounting standards.
Right. Well, this goes back to something called the Public Employee Pension Transparency Act, which I think was first introduced in 2013 and gets reintroduced in Congress periodically. And that's actually a very light touch act, although it seems to really ruffle some people's feathers. All it says is that state and local governments, for accounting purposes, would have to calculate the value of their pension benefits, the cost of their pension promises, using an accounting standard that is widely used in other parts of the world, including Northern Europe and in Canada in some situations, where essentially they have to value the pension obligation using what's called a government bond yield curve, essentially making more modest assumptions about what the assets are gonna earn in the fund. And then if there's a positive surprise, then we're positively surprised instead of constantly being in the situation of assuming very, very high returns and then being disappointed when we don't achieve them. But it's really it would be just a measurement point. And I think that's the key, is that cities and states need to properly measure the cost of these pension programs, because otherwise they're basically telling the employees on the one hand that they're going to pay them these pensions, and they're promising on behalf of taxpayers that taxpayers are going to come in and provide extra resources if the money that the state has set aside is not sufficient. But what the taxpayers and the voters don't understand is that the assumptions under which these state and local governments are operating are just so extremely optimistic in terms of not only of what the investment returns are going to be, but also other things that might affect the pension costs, like longevity. They're assuming that longevity isn't going to be that long, and other things. And so you put these together, and I think the federal government can play a role there on an accounting standard that just would add a lot of transparency to what state and local governments are doing. And it's a problem that is. It's not just a blue state problem. Plenty of red states. I think the two worst funded pension systems in the U.S. are Illinois and Kentucky. So you have New Jersey is also in competition. But you have something that's not a single partisan issue when it comes to the fact that there are these unfunded liabilities that are making it difficult for. They're really taking over state budgets, I think, is the way to think about it. They're actually taking up a bigger and bigger chunk of state and local government budgets.
Is your sense that state and local policymakers in California are starting to confront the evidence you've gathered on outmigration? Are there more people realizing that things can't continue as they have, that the state needs to embrace spending discipline and move in a different direction?
I think there's some recognition of it. I think the real recognition will only come when the budgetary forecasts are not met by a very, very wide margin, and the state's got to start cutting things. Already, we have a very, very large deficit emerging for this year. Though we had a big surplus last year, we spent all of that. Now we've got a deficit that's emerging this year that's, I think, now running around 33 or 34 billion as of the latest look in, but is probably going to be even bigger than that. I have noticed Governor Newsom in some of his speeches referring to the stock market point, referring to the fact, bringing up again the fact that the state's revenues are really dependent on the stock market, and the stock market's not doing well. But it has a little bit more of the flavor of an excuse. So, well, it's not our fault. The stock market's not doing well. So, what are we going to do? Well, what you could do is you could really reform the tax system. And he has actually called for legislature to think about doing something that would reduce the volatility of tax revenues. What that's going to be without also increasing the level of tax revenues and the overall tax burden by a lot, there haven't been any suggestions.
Professor Rauh, thank you very much for joining us on Manhattan Insights.
Thank you, Ryan.
Listeners, don't forget to check out his work for the Manhattan Institute. We'll link to a scholar page in the podcast description. If you like what you heard on the podcast, please feel free to write a review wherever you listen, and be sure to tune in to future episodes of Manhattan Insights. I'm your host, Raihan Salam.